The war within. Why the flesh attacks, what the spirit is building. There is a war that most people never name, yet everyone feels. It is not fought with weapons, borders, or visible enemies. It is fought in silence, inside the human soul. This is the war within, the constant tension between what pulls us downward and what calls us upward, between the flesh that seeks comfort, control, and immediate satisfaction, and the spirit that longs for truth, discipline, purpose, and transcendence. Many people mistake this conflict for anxiety, confusion, lack of motivation, or self-sabotage. In reality, it is something far more ancient and far more deliberate. Whenever the spirit begins to rise, the flesh reacts. Whenever something meaningful starts to form inside you, clarity, discipline, faith, vision, or moral strength, resistance appears almost immediately. This resistance is not random. It does not arrive by accident. The flesh attacks precisely because something real is being built. The inner war intensifies not when you are lost, but when you are becoming. The tragedy is that most people misinterpret this inner friction. They believe that struggle means failure, that resistance means they are on the wrong path. In truth, the opposite is often the case. Resistance is frequently proof of alignment. The flesh does not attack emptiness. It attacks growth. It attacks direction. It attacks spiritual construction. This is why moments of transformation are often accompanied by exhaustion, temptation, distraction, and doubt. It is why people abandon discipline just as it starts to work, quit paths that are beginning to bear fruit, and sabotage relationships, habits, and callings that require spiritual maturity. The flesh fears what the spirit is capable of becoming. This series explores that hidden battle in depth. It is not about condemning the body or glorifying suffering. It is about understanding the mechanics of inner resistance so you can stop fighting blindly. When you understand why the flesh reacts the way it does, you stop identifying with it. You stop mistaking its voice for your true self. You begin to recognize its tactics, and once you recognize them, they lose much of their power. In the following topics, we will examine why the flesh attacks what the spirit is building, how this conflict manifests psychologically, emotionally, and spiritually, and how those who learn to endure this war emerge stronger, clearer, and more aligned than ever before. This is not a message for the comfortable. It is for those who feel the tension, who sense that something greater is forming within them, and who are tired of sabotaging their own becoming. We begin at the foundation, understanding what the flesh truly is, why it feels threatened by spiritual growth, and why its resistance is not your enemy, but a signal that you are changing. The nature of the flesh and why it fears spiritual construction. The flesh is often misunderstood. Many people think of it only in physical terms: desire, appetite, pleasure, or instinct. But the flesh is far more than the body. It is a system of survival-based consciousness shaped by fear, conditioning, habit, and the need for immediate comfort. The flesh is not evil by default. It exists to protect you. Its purpose is preservation. Its weakness is that it confuses safety with stagnation. The flesh wants predictability. It wants familiarity. It wants control over outcomes and avoidance of discomfort. Anything that threatens these priorities is perceived as danger, even if that threat is actually growth. The flesh does not evaluate based on meaning or long-term purpose. It evaluates based on immediate sensation, pleasure versus pain, ease versus effort, certainty versus risk. The spirit, on the other hand, operates by an entirely different logic. The spirit is oriented toward truth rather than comfort, toward transformation rather than stability, toward purpose rather than convenience. When the spirit begins to build something, discipline, integrity, faith, mastery, or inner freedom, it requires sacrifice. It demands patience. It requires the willingness to sit with discomfort without escaping it. This is where conflict becomes inevitable. From the flesh's perspective, spiritual construction looks like a threat. Discipline threatens indulgence, silence threatens distraction, responsibility threatens avoidance, truth threatens illusions that once provided emotional shelter. When the spirit begins to assert direction, the flesh interprets it as loss of control, loss of familiar coping mechanisms, loss of identity structures built around comfort and avoidance. This is why inner resistance often intensifies at the exact moment when clarity arrives. A person may suddenly feel called to change their life, to walk away from destructive patterns, to commit to something meaningful. Almost immediately, the flesh responds with fatigue, doubt, nostalgia for old habits or sudden cravings for distraction. This is not coincidence, it is defense. The flesh has survived by repeating what once worked. Even if those patterns are now destructive, they are familiar. Familiar pain feels safer than unfamiliar growth. The flesh would rather endure known suffering than risk transformation that it cannot predict or control. This is why people often sabotage progress in subtle ways. They overthink instead of acting. They wait for perfect conditions that never arrive. They question their worthiness just as opportunity appears. They return to old habits not because they want to, but because the flesh is trying to restore equilibrium. Another crucial aspect of the flesh is identity attachment. The flesh is deeply invested in who you have been because identity provides structure. When the spirit begins to build something new, it threatens the old self-image. Growth requires death. Not physical death, but the death of outdated identities, roles, and narratives. The flesh resists this because it equates identity loss with annihilation. This is why spiritual growth often triggers existential anxiety. When you outgrow old versions of yourself, there is a temporary void. The flesh hates voids. It rushes to fill them with noise, stimulation, drama, or regression. It would rather you return to a smaller version of yourself than remain in the uncertainty of becoming. The flesh also thrives on external validation. It measures worth by comparison, approval, and visible reward. The spirit, however, often builds in silence. Its rewards are internal at first: clarity, peace, alignment, things the flesh does not immediately recognize as valuable. This mismatch creates impatience. The flesh demands proof now. The spirit asks for trust. Because of this, many people abandon spiritual paths prematurely. They mistake the absence of immediate gratification for failure. They assume that because the journey feels lonely, difficult, or invisible, it must be wrong. In reality, these are often signs that the spirit is working beneath the surface, restructuring foundations that cannot be rebuilt overnight. It is also important to understand that the flesh is reactive, while the spirit is intentional. The flesh responds to stimuli, the spirit responds to meaning. When the spirit begins to lead, the flesh loses its position of authority. This loss of dominance is experienced as inner chaos. Old impulses no longer provide satisfaction. Old distractions lose their power. This transitional discomfort is often interpreted as something being wrong, when in fact something false is being dismantled. The flesh attacks what the spirit is building because it senses its own diminishing influence. As discipline grows, impulsiveness weakens. As awareness increases, unconscious patterns are exposed. As purpose becomes clearer, meaningless pursuits lose appeal. The flesh experiences this as a form of starvation, not of the body, but of the egoic structures it depends on. This is why resistance often takes the form of rationalization. The flesh does not always scream, it often whispers. It disguises itself as logic, caution, or practicality. It says things like, "Now is not the right time," "You need to be realistic," or "You are asking too much of yourself." These voices sound reasonable, but they are often fear wearing the mask of wisdom. Understanding this dynamic is essential because the goal is not to destroy the flesh, but to put it in its proper place. The flesh is meant to serve the spirit, not rule it. When the flesh dominates, life becomes reactive and small. When the spirit leads, the flesh becomes an instrument rather than a master. The inner war intensifies when this hierarchy begins to shift. If you are experiencing resistance, confusion, or temptation precisely when you're trying to build something meaningful within yourself, it is not proof that you are failing. It is evidence that the structure of your inner world is changing. This awareness alone can transform how you relate to struggle. Instead of panicking when resistance arises, you begin to observe it. Instead of identifying with every impulse, you create distance. You recognize that discomfort is not an enemy. It is a threshold. Those who endure this phase without retreating discover something profound. The flesh eventually adapts. What once felt unbearable becomes manageable. What once triggered resistance becomes neutral. And what once seemed impossible becomes integrated into daily life. But this only happens if the spirit is allowed to continue building. If this message resonates with you, if you recognize this inner battle in your own life, and if you want to continue exploring how to overcome this war within and allow the spirit to lead without self-sabotage, subscribe to the channel now. What comes next will deepen your understanding and give you the clarity needed to continue the path you have already begun. One of the most dangerous moments in any spiritual journey is not when a person is lost, but when they begin to awaken. This is the stage where clarity starts to form, where values shift, where discipline feels possible, and where the spirit begins to outline a new internal structure. It is precisely at this point that self-sabotage becomes most aggressive, not because you are weak, but because something inside you is being reordered. The flesh senses this shift and reacts with urgency. Self-sabotage is not random behavior. It is not a moral failure or lack of intelligence. It is a protective reflex of the flesh, designed to preserve the familiar identity at all costs. When the spirit starts building something new, the flesh interprets it as an existential threat. It does not distinguish between destruction and transformation. To the flesh, any dismantling of old patterns feels like annihilation. This is why people often experience a surge of destructive impulses right after moments of insight. A person may decide to commit to discipline, clarity, or spiritual alignment and suddenly feel an overwhelming pull toward distraction, indulgence, procrastination, or emotional numbing. This is not coincidence. It is resistance triggered by proximity to change. The flesh thrives on patterns. Even painful patterns feel safe if they are known. Familiar suffering feels controllable. Growth, on the other hand, introduces uncertainty. The spirit operates in faith, but the flesh operates in proof. When the spirit begins to lead, the flesh panics because it cannot predict the outcome. This panic manifests as self-sabotage. One of the most common forms of sabotage is delay. The flesh convinces you that you need more preparation, more information, more certainty before acting. It frames hesitation as wisdom, but behind this hesitation is fear. Fear of responsibility, fear of exposure, fear of becoming someone who can no longer hide behind excuses. Another form is emotional regression. As soon as progress is made, old emotional wounds resurface. The flesh brings unresolved pain to the surface, not to heal it, but to overwhelm you. It floods the nervous system, hoping you will retreat to old coping mechanisms. This is why people often relapse into habits they thought they had outgrown. The flesh is trying to restore its sense of control. Distraction is another powerful weapon. When the spirit seeks silence and focus, the flesh introduces noise, endless scrolling, unnecessary conversations, overconsumption of information. Compulsive entertainment. These are not harmless habits. They fragment attention. A fragmented mind cannot sustain spiritual construction. The flesh knows this. What makes self-sabotage particularly dangerous is that it often feels like relief in the moment. Returning to old habits temporarily reduces anxiety because it restores familiarity. But this relief is deceptive. It trades long-term alignment for short-term comfort. Over time, this pattern creates deep inner conflict because the spirit remembers what was possible. Another subtle tactic of the flesh is identity confusion. As the spirit grows, the old identity begins to dissolve. This creates a psychological void. The flesh fills this void with doubt. Who do you think you are to change? This is not really you. You are betraying your past. These thoughts are not truths. They are echoes of outdated self-definitions trying to survive. Many people confuse these inner voices with intuition, but intuition is calm and clear. The flesh is anxious and reactive. Intuition guides. The flesh pressures. Learning to distinguish between the two is essential for overcoming self-sabotage. The flesh also uses perfectionism as a trap. It convinces you that unless conditions are ideal, action is pointless. This leads to paralysis. Spiritual growth does not require perfection. It requires consistency. The flesh hates consistency because it erodes impulsive authority. Small, repeated acts of discipline weaken the flesh far more than dramatic bursts of effort. Shame is another mechanism. When you stumble, the flesh amplifies guilt, convincing you that failure defines you. This leads to discouragement and withdrawal. The spirit, however, views failure as feedback, not identity. The flesh wants you to quit. The spirit wants you to learn. Self-sabotage also appears in relationships. As the spirit matures, certain connections no longer resonate. The flesh clings to them anyway, fearing loneliness. It would rather maintain draining relationships than face the solitude required for growth. This is why many people feel pulled backward by their environment just as they begin to evolve. It is important to understand that self-sabotage intensifies when spiritual construction threatens comfort zones. The closer you get to alignment, the louder the resistance becomes. This does not mean you are doing something wrong. It means you are approaching a threshold. The key is awareness. Once you recognize self-sabotage as a defensive response rather than a personal flaw, its power diminishes. You stop identifying with every impulse. You stop reacting automatically. You begin to pause. This pause is critical. In that space between impulse and action, the spirit can assert leadership. You do not need to fight the flesh aggressively. You need to observe it calmly. Observation creates separation. Separation creates choice. Over time, as the spirit continues to build, the flesh adapts. What once felt threatening becomes normal. Discipline becomes familiar. Silence becomes tolerable. Purpose becomes grounding. The flesh learns that it will not die from growth. It simply loses its position as ruler. Those who overcome self-sabotage do not do so by force. They do so by consistency, awareness, and patience. They accept discomfort without fleeing it. They allow the new identity to form gradually. They understand that resistance is part of the process, not a sign of failure. If you are experiencing inner conflict, repeated setbacks, or moments where you undermine your own progress, it does not mean you are broken. It means something meaningful is trying to emerge. The flesh is reacting because the spirit is building. Stay with the process. Do not retreat simply because it feels unfamiliar. Growth always feels unfamiliar at first. If this message speaks to your experience and you want to continue understanding this inner war and how to move through it without losing yourself along the way, subscribe to the channel. The next topic will take this even deeper and show how this conflict shapes identity, faith, and destiny. As the war between flesh and spirit intensifies, one of its most profound effects is on identity itself. This stage of the inner battle is not primarily about habits, discipline, or temptation anymore. It is about who you believe you are. The flesh does not merely resist spiritual growth through impulse or distraction. It resists by reshaping the story you tell yourself about your own limits. When the spirit begins to build something enduring, the flesh responds by attacking identity at its core. Identity is powerful because it governs behavior automatically. You do not have to consciously decide how to act when your actions align with who you believe you are. The flesh understands this. It knows that if it can keep your identity small, fearful, or fragmented, it will not need to fight every decision individually. The war then becomes subtle, psychological, and deeply personal. This is why spiritual growth often triggers an identity crisis. As the spirit awakens, old labels begin to lose meaning. You no longer fully identify with who you were, but you have not yet fully embodied who you are becoming. This in-between space is uncomfortable, unstable, and vulnerable. The flesh exploits this vulnerability relentlessly. During this phase, the flesh begins to whisper questions that feel existential. Who are you without your past? If you change, what will remain? If you let go of these patterns, will you still belong anywhere? These questions are not neutral inquiries. They are fear-driven attempts to destabilize the construction of a new inner foundation. The spirit builds forward, but the flesh pulls backward by resurrecting old narratives. It brings up past failures, mistakes, and moments of weakness as evidence that transformation is impossible. It tells you that growth is an illusion, that this new direction is temporary, that you will eventually return to who you have always been. This is not memory, it is sabotage disguised as realism. One of the most painful tactics the flesh uses at this stage is shame. Shame is not simply guilt over actions. It is the belief that your essence is flawed. When shame takes hold, the spirit's work feels illegitimate. You may begin to feel unworthy of peace, clarity, or purpose. The flesh uses this to undermine spiritual construction by attacking your sense of deserving. This is why many people abandon their growth, not because they cannot endure discipline, but because they cannot endure self-respect. The flesh convinces them that they are imposters in their own becoming. It frames spiritual growth as arrogance or self-deception. Who do you think you are to rise? It asks. This question is devastating if left unexamined. Another layer of this identity war is social reflection. As the spirit evolves, your internal frequency changes. Old environments, conversations, and relationships may begin to feel misaligned. The flesh reacts with fear of isolation. It tells you that if you continue, you will be alone, misunderstood, or rejected. Because humans are wired for belonging, this fear is powerful. The flesh would rather you remain accepted and stagnant than aligned and alone. It frames conformity as safety and authenticity as danger. This is why so many people suppress their spiritual growth in social settings. They silence their values, dilute their truth, and retreat into old roles just to avoid standing out. The spirit, however, does not seek isolation for its own sake. It seeks alignment. Sometimes alignment requires separation, not permanent isolation but temporary solitude. The flesh hates solitude because without external noise, its illusions are exposed. Silence reveals truth. Stillness dismantles false identities. As the spirit builds, you may notice a growing discomfort with superficial interactions. This is not arrogance, it is sensitivity. Your inner world is becoming more ordered, and chaos becomes harder to tolerate. The flesh interprets this sensitivity as weakness or instability. In reality, it is refinement. At this stage, many people experience a sense of mourning. They grieve versions of themselves that no longer fit. They grieve relationships that cannot follow them forward. They grieve dreams that were built on false foundations. The flesh resists this grief by clinging to nostalgia. It idealizes the past, forgetting its pain, and uses it to pull you backward. Nostalgia is one of the flesh's most deceptive tools. It reframes stagnation as comfort and growth as loss. It convinces you that returning is safer than continuing. But the spirit knows something the flesh cannot accept. What you are becoming cannot be sustained by what you were. This identity transformation also affects faith. Old belief systems may crack, questions arise, certainty dissolves. The flesh uses this uncertainty to provoke fear, suggesting that doubt means failure. The spirit, however, uses questioning as a refining fire. Faith that cannot be questioned remains fragile. Faith that survives questioning becomes unshakable. The flesh fears this depth. It prefers shallow certainty to deep trust. It wants answers, not wisdom. It wants guarantees, not alignment. When the spirit begins to rebuild faith from within, rather than borrowing it from external structures, the flesh reacts with anxiety. This is why many people cling rigidly to old frameworks, even when they no longer resonate. The flesh prefers rigid belief to living truth. The spirit invites movement, growth, and expansion. This movement feels like instability at first, but it leads to internal coherence. Another manifestation of this stage is exhaustion, not physical exhaustion alone, but existential fatigue. Carrying two identities at once is draining. The old self has not fully died, and the new self is not fully formed. The flesh uses this fatigue as evidence that the journey is unsustainable. It urges retreat under the guise of self-care. True rest, however, does not come from retreating into old patterns. It comes from integration. The spirit does not demand constant striving. It demands honesty. It asks you to stop pretending to be who you no longer are. This honesty is initially exhausting, but ultimately liberating. The turning point in this stage comes when you stop negotiating with the old identity, not by rejecting it with hatred, but by acknowledging its service and releasing its authority. The flesh loses power when it is no longer treated as the decision-maker. You begin to realize that identity is not something you defend, it is something you embody. The more consistently you act from alignment, the less the old narratives matter. Over time, the new identity stabilizes. The questions quiet. The fear softens. The war does not end, but it changes form. Those who persist through this stage emerge with a deeper sense of self than they have ever known. Not a performative identity, but an internal one. Not based on approval, but on coherence. This is the kind of identity that cannot be shaken easily because it was forged through inner conflict rather than borrowed from external validation. If you are in this phase, questioning who you are, feeling disconnected from your past, sensing that you are becoming someone unfamiliar, do not retreat. This discomfort is not a sign that you are lost. It is evidence that the spirit is restructuring your foundation. Stay present. Stay honest. Let the old identity dissolve without clinging to it. What is being built within you is stronger than what is falling away. If this resonates with your experience and you want to continue exploring how this inner war shapes destiny, faith, and purpose, subscribe to the channel. What comes next will deepen this understanding even further and help you navigate the path ahead with clarity and strength. As the spirit continues to build beneath the surface, a critical shift begins to occur that many people misunderstand. The war between flesh and spirit moves from being primarily reactive to becoming strategic. At this stage, the flesh no longer relies only on impulse, temptation, or emotional chaos. Instead, it adopts a more refined tactic. It attempts to exhaust you, not through overt destruction, but through prolonged internal pressure. This is the phase where many people do not fall dramatically, but slowly give up. Spiritual exhaustion is different from physical tiredness. Physical fatigue can be resolved with rest. Spiritual exhaustion comes from sustained inner conflict without resolution. It is the weariness that emerges when a person is constantly resisting impulses, questioning motives, suppressing doubt, and holding themselves together while something new is still forming. The flesh exploits this liminal state with precision. At this point, the flesh no longer argues loudly. It becomes subtle and patient. It introduces thoughts like, "You have been trying long enough, nothing is really changing," or "This effort is costing too much." These thoughts feel rational because exhaustion lowers discernment. When energy is low, the mind becomes vulnerable to distorted conclusions. This is why many people abandon their spiritual path not during chaos, but during apparent calm. The intensity decreases, the dramatic tension fades, and what remains is routine. The flesh thrives in this moment because it reframes consistency as stagnation. It convinces you that because growth is no longer emotionally intense, it must no longer be meaningful. The spirit builds quietly. Once the initial awakening passes, the work becomes repetitive, disciplined, and largely invisible. There are fewer emotional highs. There is less external validation. The flesh interprets this as loss. It craves stimulation, affirmation, and novelty. When these are absent, it manufactures dissatisfaction. Another weapon of the flesh at this stage is comparison. It draws your attention outward, urging you to measure your progress against others. They seem further ahead. They are more gifted. They received recognition faster. Comparison drains spiritual energy because it shifts focus from alignment to performance. The spirit grows inwardly. Comparison pulls attention outward. The flesh uses comparison to induce discouragement. Discouragement is powerful because it feels justified. It masquerades as realism. But realism without wisdom becomes resignation. The flesh does not want you to fail loudly. It wants you to stop caring. This is also the phase where meaning is tested. The flesh asks, "Is this worth it?" The spirit does not answer this question with words. It answers through coherence. But coherence takes time to feel. The flesh demands immediate reassurance. When it does not receive it, it creates doubt. Another form of exhaustion arises from internal perfectionism. The flesh demands flawless execution, even though it resists consistency. This creates a contradiction that drains energy. You feel pressured to be perfect while feeling too tired to continue. The result is paralysis. The spirit asks only for sincerity and persistence, but the flesh reframes this as insufficiency. At this stage, people often feel a sense of emptiness, not the emptiness of despair, but the emptiness of transition. Old pleasures no longer satisfy. New depth has not yet fully integrated. The flesh interprets this emptiness as failure. In reality, it is space being created. Transformation requires emptying. Something must be removed before something new can take root. The flesh hates emptiness because emptiness cannot be controlled. It fills emptiness with noise, obligation, or regression. The spirit uses emptiness as fertile ground. The danger here is mistaking spiritual silence for absence. Many people believe that if they do not feel inspired, they are disconnected. But inspiration is not the foundation of spiritual growth. Commitment is. The flesh idolizes feeling. The spirit honors consistency. This is why routine becomes sacred at this stage. Simple practices, repeated daily, begin to anchor the spirit. The flesh resists routine because routine removes drama. Without drama, the flesh loses leverage. But without routine, the spirit cannot stabilize what it is building. Another challenge in this phase is delayed reward. The spirit builds for long-term alignment, but the flesh lives for immediate gratification. When rewards are delayed, The flesh grows restless. It urges shortcuts. It tempts you to abandon the slow path for faster but hollow alternatives. This is where discernment becomes essential. Not every opportunity is aligned. Not every door that opens is meant to be entered. The flesh mistakes movement for progress. The spirit values direction over speed. Spiritual exhaustion also reveals itself in cynicism. The flesh uses cynicism to protect itself from disappointment. It convinces you that belief is naive, that hope is dangerous, that commitment leads to pain. Cynicism feels intelligent, but it is often fear pretending to be wisdom. The spirit does not deny pain, it integrates it. The flesh avoids pain by disengaging from meaning altogether. This disengagement is subtle and gradual. You may still perform the actions, but the heart withdraws. This is the most dangerous form of retreat because it is invisible. The antidote to this stage is not force, but renewal of intention, returning to why you began. Not emotionally, but truthfully. The spirit does not require constant motivation. It requires remembrance. Remembering what called you forward reactivates coherence. Another key at this stage is patience with slowness. Growth that lasts is rarely fast. The flesh equates speed with success. The spirit understands that depth requires time. Roots grow in darkness. What is being built inside you may not be visible yet, but it is stabilizing. Those who endure this phase without abandoning their path experience a profound shift. The inner war becomes quieter, not because the flesh disappears, but because it loses urgency. Its threats lose intensity. Its tactics become predictable. This is when spiritual maturity begins to emerge. You stop reacting to every impulse. You stop needing constant reassurance. You move forward without drama. The flesh finds this deeply unsatisfying because its power depended on volatility. If you are feeling tired, disillusioned, or quietly questioning whether the journey is worth continuing, understand this. This is not the end. It is the refinement. You are not failing. You are stabilizing. Do not abandon the path simply because it no longer feels intense. What is being built now is stronger than what was built in excitement. Stay consistent. Stay grounded. Let the spirit finish what it has begun. If this message speaks to where you are right now, and you want to continue understanding how to move through this inner war without losing your strength or direction, subscribe to the channel. The final topic will bring everything together and show how those who endure this process emerge transformed, grounded, and unshakable. There comes a moment in this inner war when something irreversible happens. It is not dramatic. There is no sudden victory, no emotional explosion, no external confirmation. Instead, there is a quiet shift in authority. The spirit no longer fights to be heard. It simply leads, and the flesh, though still present, no longer commands. This is the stage that separates those who merely awaken from those who are transformed. Up to this point, the war has been loud, exhausting, confusing, and deeply personal. The flesh attacked through impulse, distraction, identity distortion, exhaustion, and doubt. It tried to pull you backward, sideways, or into stillness disguised as safety. But now something fundamental has changed. The spirit has built enough internal structure to stand on its own. What once required effort now requires honesty. What once demanded resistance now demands consistency. This stage is not the end of the conflict, but it is the end of domination. The flesh no longer defines reality. It no longer dictates identity. It no longer interprets discomfort as danger. The spirit has learned to remain present without reacting. This alone alters everything. One of the clearest signs of this shift is silence. Not the absence of thought, but the absence of inner noise, the compulsive urgency to escape, explain, justify, or numb begins to fade. You no longer feel the same pressure to distract yourself from discomfort. You can sit with uncertainty without panicking. This does not mean fear disappears. It means fear no longer decides. The flesh loses power when it is no longer believed. Its thoughts may still arise, but they no longer feel authoritative. You recognize them as echoes, not commands. This recognition creates freedom. You stop arguing with every impulse. You stop negotiating with every doubt. You act from alignment, not reaction. At this stage, discipline becomes natural, not rigid, not forced, but integrated. You no longer rely on motivation because motivation is unstable. You rely on coherence. Your actions begin to match your values, not because you are trying harder, but because deviation feels uncomfortable. Integrity becomes internal gravity. The flesh resists this quietly at first. It attempts one final strategy, resignation. It whispers that this clarity is temporary, that peace will not last, that something will eventually go wrong. This is not prophecy. It is fear grieving its loss of control. The spirit does not promise permanence. It promises presence. Presence is enough. Another profound change at this stage is the relationship with suffering. Earlier, suffering felt like punishment or failure. Now it feels like information. Pain is no longer personalized. It is contextualized. You stop asking, "Why is this happening to me?" and begin asking, "What is this revealing?" This shift dissolves resentment. The flesh cannot survive long in an environment without resentment. Resentment fuels identity-based suffering. When resentment dissolves, suffering becomes transient rather than defining. You still feel pain, but it does not fracture you. It moves through you. This is also the stage where external validation loses its grip. Praise no longer inflates you. Criticism no longer devastates you. Approval is appreciated, but no longer required. The flesh depended heavily on external feedback to regulate self-worth. The spirit generates worth internally through alignment. As this internal authority stabilizes, your perception of time changes. You become less rushed. Urgency fades. You stop feeling behind. The flesh thrived on scarcity, the belief that time, opportunity, or worth was limited. The spirit operates from sufficiency. It knows that what is aligned unfolds at the right pace. Relationships also change at this stage. You no longer seek connection to fill emptiness. You seek resonance. Some connections deepen. Others dissolve naturally without bitterness. You stop forcing compatibility. The flesh feared separation because it equated it with abandonment. The spirit understands that separation is sometimes clarity. Another subtle transformation occurs in decision-making. You stop overthinking, not because decisions become easier, but because inner noise has diminished. Choices are guided by coherence rather than anxiety. You do not need to convince yourself endlessly. You sense alignment or misalignment and act accordingly. The flesh still attempts to intervene through nostalgia or fantasy, but its pull is weak. You are no longer seduced by imagined pasts or idealized futures. You are anchored in what is real. This anchoring brings a calm confidence that does not need to be announced. This is the point where the war within becomes a discipline rather than a struggle. You understand the patterns. You recognize the tactics. The flesh no longer surprises you. It no longer defines you. It becomes something you manage rather than something you obey. Importantly, this stage does not make you superior. It makes you humble. You see how easily you could return to old patterns if awareness is abandoned. This humility keeps you grounded. The spirit does not seek domination, it seeks stewardship. One of the greatest gifts of this stage is peace without explanation. You do not need to justify your choices. You do not need to convince others of your path. You stop defending what feels internally coherent. Defense was required when alignment was fragile. Now it is stable. This stability allows you to serve rather than prove. Whether through creativity, presence, leadership, or quiet integrity, your life begins to radiate rather than argue. The flesh thrived on argument. The spirit influences through embodiment. Even suffering at this stage becomes meaningful, not because pain is glorified, but because it is integrated. You no longer fear breakdowns because you trust your capacity to rebuild without losing yourself. The flesh feared collapse because it depended on illusion. The spirit trusts truth. This is where destiny quietly aligns, not as a dramatic calling, but as a natural unfolding. You find yourself in the right conversations, the right work, the right silence. You stop chasing meaning and start recognizing it. The war within does not end because the flesh disappears. It ends because the spirit has learned how to lead without force. This is the deepest victory, not suppression, but integration. If you have reached this stage, or even glimpsed it, understand that what you have built cannot be taken easily. You are no longer who you were, and you do not need to rush to become who you will be. You are present. That is enough. If this entire journey resonates with you, if you recognize this inner war in your own life, and if you want to continue walking this path of clarity, discipline, and spiritual alignment, subscribe to the channel. What we build here is not entertainment, it is transformation.